We are just a little over 24 hours from the first results rolling in from the 2014 midterm elections. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm Tiffany O'Donnell.
And I'm Scott Sanborn. Iowa's U.S. Senate race is just one of many being carefully watched across the nation. Republican Joni Ernst and Democrat Bruce Braley are battling to fill the seat being vacated by Democrat Tom Harkin. In a Quinnipiac poll released just today, the two are in a dead heat, both with 47%. But the Des Moines Register poll from the weekend has Ernst up by 7%. Republicans need 6 seats to take control of the Senate, which is currently controlled by Democrats. There are 11 battleground states that could come down to the wire.
Republicans appear to have locked up 3 of those 6 seats already, with West Virginia, Montana, and South Dakota likely electing Republicans to seats where Democratic senators are retiring. So that means Republicans need 3 more. There are 7 states, including Iowa, where seats held by Democrats are considered vulnerable.
Okay, if the Republicans get the seats they need, that would mean the GOP would control the House and Senate for the first time since the 2008 election.
CBS 2 News political correspondent Kevin Barry has been tracking the Iowa Senate race all along and has a look at just how we got where we are today with our local candidates.
Many of the most recent polls give the momentum to Republican Joni Ernst, but much of what's plagued the Braley camp happened before Ernst was her party's official nominee. His first major misstep was in late March when he spoke about Republican Senator Chuck Grassley at a private fundraiser.
You might have a farmer from Iowa who never went to law school, never practiced law, serving as the next chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
At the time, Quinnipiac and Rasmussen polls both said Braley had a 4 to 5 point lead over Ernst before having to apologize to Grassley.
I don't want somebody to read something in that maybe it was a paraphrasing of a statement that raises even more questions, because I don't want any more questions raised. I'm moving on.
At just about the same time, Joni Ernst's campaign released its squeal ad.
I'm Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm,
which raised eyebrows both in and outside Iowa.
Well, I don't know what she's running for, but we just give her the job.
On June 3rd, Ernst walked away with the primary, pulling in 56% of the vote in the 5-way race.
Some of you may know that I did more than just feed the hogs.
With just Braley in her sights since the middle of the summer, Ernst's numbers have been even with or better than Braley's since. She kept her own message simple.
Our Iowa way is working. What we're seeing from the federal government and from Congressman Braley is not.
In debate, she accused Braley of ignoring veterans' needs, flip-flopping on the Affordable Care Act, and threatening litigation over a neighbor's chickens coming into his yard. One ad says Braley pays his female staffers much less than their male counterparts.
It's blatantly false, and the congressional pay records prove that it's false, because the truth is that I've paid women in my congressional office on average $1.02 for every $1 that I pay my male employees.
The accusations themselves have had varying levels of truth to them, but they forced Braley to take time to respond, pushing him off his own message.
I'll tell you what I think is ridiculous. A hardworking Iowan in a full-time job, 40 hours a week at minimum wage, earning $15,000 a year and living below the poverty line.
At the end of the campaign season, Ernst's momentum almost hit a speed bump when she declined to meet with various newspaper editorial boards, leading to the papers endorsing Bruce Braley.
What is Joni Ernst trying to hide?
She said she avoided some papers because they had been critical of her in the past. The papers said they couldn't endorse her over Braley if she wouldn't meet with them.
It truly seems like it should be disqualifying in Iowa, of all states, to avoid answering questions.
Despite what some are calling a late mistake, snubbing the papers, Joni Ernst had built up a lead in Iowa large enough for Democrats to worry about, until Quinnipiac released numbers that have them dead even today.
But I'm asking you to ignore the polls. They can be misleading, they can be a sedative, they can sap your energy, and we need to stay fired up.
And that was Kevin Braley reporting for us. Joining us now, our political analyst, Professor Tim Hagel from the University of Iowa. And Professor Hagel, we touched briefly on the importance of that particular Senate race. When the rubber hits the road, really, how important is that?
It could be very important. It could be critical in terms of determining which party has control of the U.S. Senate after these elections. That there are several outlets and some individuals that have basically pegged Iowa as the pivotal state. You mentioned the 3 before in your commentary, and there were probably a couple of others where it's a little bit more likely that the Republican would win. But here in Iowa, it's just so close that we could be that pivotal 6th seat that the Republicans need to take control.
Yeah. If Republicans do take the Senate, that gives more power to Senator Chuck Grassley. Explain why that's important.
It's important because he would then be in the majority, and the majority controls who gets the chair of the various committees and subcommittees. And as was in the clip indicated, that possibly that would mean he would be the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it's very likely that we'll have some not only vacancies in the lower federal courts, but even the U.S. Supreme Court.
You know, we've been following polls so closely here. There's been a pretty wide shift, I would say, over the weekend. The Register poll having Ernst up 7 and then neck and neck with Quinnipiac, and now she's back to a 4-point lead in that poll you referenced. How do you explain that?
I could do a long dissertation on how to deal with polls. You always have to take them with a grain of salt, for starters, and it's not so much that the electorate is shifting with each of these new polls, because there's always a sampling error and so forth. And so we saw on Saturday with the Register's poll, Ernst is up 7, the Quinnipiac poll that is even in the PPP polls today had her up 3. So probably it's somewhere closer to the 3 than the 7 or the tide. We just have to wait and see as far as turnout on tomorrow.
I was going to say that's what it comes down to right now. It's just getting the vote out.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And who's better at that? I mean, Republicans, I understood, usually typically show up that day of.
That's the difference, is that for the Democrats, they have traditionally been better at the early and absentee voting, and they have a lead as long as all those ballots get in, but Republicans tend to like to show up on Election Day, and so we have to see who's been better at turning out their base.
All right.
Okay. Tim, we're going to check back with you in just a moment here. In the meantime, we want to go to the House side, where Republicans are poised to keep majority control. Here's a look at our battleground tracker, and as you can see, the Democrats have a solid lead in 145 of 435 districts, with about 45 districts in flux.
Republicans have a solid 183 districts, with nearly 50 heading that way. Experts say Republicans will most likely add to their already established majority, gaining 6 more seats, possibly as many as 12. One of the open seats is being left behind by Braley as he tries to work his way, as we mentioned, into the Senate. Democrat Pat Murphy and Republican Rod Blum are in a very tight race for that opening. Murphy, of course, a state representative and former Iowa House Speaker. Blum is a software business owner from Dubuque. Although the 1st District has historically been represented by Republicans, it has become heavily Democratic.
The District 2 House race hasn't gotten as much attention. Democrat Dave Loebsack is sitting on a huge lead over Republican Marionette Miller Meeks. This district historically is Democratic. But Tim, let's go back to that 1st District race. As Tiffany alluded to, you know, it's been held by a Democrat for so long. Give us the big picture here if they're able to switch it to the Republican side.
Well, there are a number of seats that, of course, 2 open seats here in Iowa. It's not likely, though, that whatever happens here in Iowa is going to affect the overall party control in the U.S. House, simply because there aren't enough seats that are in play, really, for the Democrats to have a solid chance of taking control. The key is maybe whether they win a few seats, so that reduces the Republican majority a little bit, makes it a little bit harder for them to get things through, or it could be if Republicans have a good night, which is what most people are expecting, that maybe they could end up with a historic for them majority in the House.
You know, how do you explain, Ben Lang defeated Rod Blum last time around.
Right.
Not his first rodeo. And this time it seems he's gained some traction. How come?
Well, one of the things that I've heard him talk about was the fact that he didn't really know how to run a campaign the first time around. That often happens, especially when you're running at that level, that there's so many things in motion that it makes it difficult for a first-time candidate to really get a handle on what's going on, even in a primary. And so the second time around in a slightly reconfigured district, he knows what's going on and has had better shots, so he got the nomination. So we'll see what happens in terms of the general.
Interesting.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, the state of Iowa has had several big-name political visitors over the past several weeks from both sides of the aisle.
Local Democratic candidates have gotten help from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to First Lady Michelle Obama. But there is one political heavy hitter you didn't see, President Barack Obama. Between Ebola, the Affordable Care Act, and the turmoil in the Middle East, the latest polls have President Obama's approval rating hovering at about 40%. He's been appearing with a few gubernatorial candidates across the country, but not that many. Instead, it's Mrs. Obama that most candidates want to see on their campaign trail. Voters we spoke with say people find her more approachable.
On the Republican side, meanwhile, there's no shortage of heavy hitters making their way through the Hawkeye State either. From former presidential candidates to current senators in other states, the corridor has been inundated with visits. Most of the visitors came with messages of support for Joni Ernst. Texas Governor Rick Perry and former presidential candidate Rick Santorum have similar views on many issues. Experts say someone like Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney could rope in the moderate Republicans, though, who may think that Ernst is too extreme. Meantime, Florida Senator Marco Rubio has a vastly different stance on immigration than Ernst, but he says the most important thing is that they can come together on the need for a Republican majority in the Senate. And that is an important point to mention there. They need to, how important was it for her to have those moderates and those with different views coming in?
Well, that was one of the things that early on we saw that was interesting about Joni Ernst was that she had Sarah Palin's endorsement, but then also Mitt Romney's. And so that gave her the tag of being a full spectrum Republican. Now, of course, that's not how the Democrats saw it, and they tried to define her in more negative terms as too extreme and so forth. But when you've got that broad spectrum from the Republican side endorsing her, makes her seem more palatable to the entire Republican base.
Yeah. You know, there have been several flubs on the campaign trail, as there are every year or every election cycle. But how important really was it for the First Lady to get Bruce Braley's name wrong? There was a lot said about that in the office that he was running for. They got it wrong in the script. Talk to us about that.
It's a funny thing because you've even heard Bruce Braley talk about how his name is just close enough to Bailey that it's been a lifelong problem for him in some respects. It's not a serious problem, but it's one of those embarrassments when things aren't necessarily going well for you anyway, that then it just kind of adds to the misery to a certain extent. But in the great scheme of things, not so much.
You know, how much do you think gender has played a role here? I mean, we hear names like Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin used very sparsely when talking about Joni Ernst. Other women in the political sphere. Has gender played a role at all here?
Republicans tend to not emphasize that as much when they have women candidates, although you have heard a number of them talking about Joni Ernst, and part of her little phrasing is that mother, soldier, leader, independent leader. So she has talked about it, but for the most part it hasn't been as big a role as you might see for a Democrat, a female Democrat running like maybe Stacey Apple in the 3rd Congressional District. So we see that, but it's also not something that is critical. But on the other hand, certain issues that are in play in this particular race, it does make a difference in terms of things like health care and birth control and things of that nature, which have been an issue.
Okay. Thanks for your insight, Tim.
Those visits from national candidates help energize the base, and campaigns hope that translates to voter turnout on Election Day and certainly in early voting.
Recording votes before November 4th has been a focus for both parties. CBS 2 News political correspondent Kevin Barry is live with Lynn County Auditor Joel Miller with how that effort has gone so far. Kevin?
Scott and Tiffany, we're here at the Gene Oxley County building, where even just now we've seen a few absentee ballots be handed in, and now we're joined by Joel Miller, the Lynn County Auditor. And you've already told us that there's been more absentee ballots in early voting this year, but how is that broken down by party? Like we were talking about before, the Republicans really made that a focus of election time this year.
Certainly that's the big surprise of this election is the number of ballots that came in early from the Republicans, and we've seen them close the gap, certainly across the state, not as much in Lynn County, but they've done very well in Lynn County, and it's just surprising to us that's happened.
What does that translate to for Election Day crowds now? Will more people vote in this election, or have the same people just voted earlier?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know if they all voted early and no one will be at the polls tomorrow, or if these are new voters that voted early, and we'll see a sizable number of people go tomorrow. So it's hard to tell. All bets are off. I'm not predicting anything for tomorrow.
If you're still looking for your voting place, we'll have all the information on where you can find it, phone numbers and websites to look through on our website, cbs2iowa.com. Covering the corridor in Cedar Rapids, Kevin Barry, CBS 2 News.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kevin. If you are planning on heading to the polls tomorrow, there is still time to do some research and figure out who you want to vote for. Just head to our website, as Kevin mentioned, for polling locations and more information on those candidates at cbs2iowa.com. Just look for the Know Your Candidates tab on the left-hand side of the main page. That'll take you to this spot we pulled up here at the desk, Know Your Candidates. It's information on every candidate running for office.
And make sure to watch CBS 2 and Fox 28 tomorrow night. Throughout the evening, we will be cutting in with election results and live coverage from candidate headquarters across the state. The Fox 28 news starts at 9, giving you the first in-depth election coverage in the corridor, followed by the CBS 2 News 10 at 10. The congressional elections being held tomorrow will go down in history as the most expensive ever.
More than $4 billion have been spent on behalf of the candidates, and that's just the money that we know about. One of the races pulling in a big portion is our own Senate race between Republican Joni Ernst and Democrat Bruce Braley. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, outside sources spent $11.8 million supporting Joni Ernst and $24.4 million opposing her. On the other side, outside sources spent $3.2 million in favor of Bruce Braley and $19.8 million against him.
Now, of that money, follow along here, 28% comes from the party's national political action committees. The next 33%, $20.3 million, comes from just 4 super PACs. Professor Tim Hagel joining us from the University of Iowa is our political analyst here this evening. You know, a lot of people, when asked what would they change about elections, a lot of people will cite big unfettered corporate money coming into the elections. How do you see that?
Well, I tend to be more of a First Amendment kind of person where I like to see that the money comes in. You want to have a certain amount of transparency, but one of the problems is that it often tends to be very negative, and that basically relieves the campaigns of having to do a lot of negative advertising themselves, but then it also leaves sort of bad taste in people's mouths.
But it's certainly no guarantee for victory, a big war chest. We've seen it time and again.
No, it's not. And there have been times when candidates have been outspent 10-1 and still lost. So a lot depends on the candidate, but if it is a close race, then maybe it can have an influence in terms of either motivating the base or getting those few undecided voters out to the polls.
I can tell you that it's also a plus for Iowa when you have people spending that kind of money.
Absolutely, and that's the big thing, is that when you have certain states, and Iowa is certainly one of them, and regardless of us having a close race this time, just the fact that because of the caucuses and when people come in, you tend to get more advertising, that's good for our economy.
You know, the national parties, do they obviously recognize like the critical nature of an Ernst Braley race, and are those national parties sending the money as well?
They are, as we saw in the graphic there, that they are invested in not just our race, of course, but those half dozen or so very close races, because again, the Republicans want to make sure they get control, Democrats want to make sure they maintain control, and so they can't be sure which races are going to be the critical ones, so they have to basically put money into a half a dozen or so of those races and try to hope for the best.
Are you for or against any campaign finance reform, Tim?
Certain reforms probably would be good, again, in terms of transparency and things of that nature, but I always see it more in line of there are reasons for people who want to group together in a PAC and spend their money. Now, I can understand, though, when it's somebody that's very wealthy that is controlling a particular PAC, and people maybe think, well, that one rich person, maybe a billionaire or something, shouldn't have that much influence, but on the other hand, they have First Amendment rights, too.
There are several other items on the ballots as well this year, including Iowa's Secretary of State and State Auditor.
One of the most talked about, but potentially least surprising, is the race for governor.
Iowa's Republican Governor Terry Branstad is going for an unprecedented and historic 6th term. He's had a steady lead over his Democratic challenger Jack Hatch. Hatch is a real estate developer who's had trouble raising money to match the incumbent's war chest. And Professor Tim Hagel from the University of Iowa joins us. And Professor, we have a lot of close races this election. This isn't one of them. Pretty clear the governor's going to come out on top here, but now let's look at what that means.
Well, basically, the big question will be how big will the margin be? And even though the Hatch campaign has tried hard, they really haven't gotten a lot of traction to close that gap in the last several weeks. And so if the governor wins by a large margin, that could, at least the Republicans hope, will affect some of the down ticket, I shouldn't say down ticket, but other statewide races, Secretary of State, the auditor's race, and so forth, where you have open seats, essentially, that could be influenced by a big turnout for the governor.
Yeah, and I would anticipate, too, that once Terry Branstad wins re-election, if that's the case, that he will just use that as saying, this is a mandate, people want my policies.
Oh, absolutely. And any governor would do that, or the president does that as well, especially if you have that big of a margin. Of course, the interesting thing is that he may win, but some Democrats will win some other seats, and so you do get a bit of a mixed message. And, of course, we have to see what happens in the state legislature as well.
Sure. Okay. Tim Hagel, once again, thank you so much. Johnson County officials, they're asking voters to approve a new local option sales tax. Iowa City, Coralville, North Liberty, University Heights, and Tiffin residents will be voting together as a block. A simple majority of combined votes from those cities is needed for the tax to pass, and only the communities that pass the tax will get the money.
If it passes, sales tax revenue from the yes communities are pooled and distributed according to a formula based on population and property taxes. This is all based on a state formula used to make sure the money gets to the communities where people live, not just where the money is spent. That means if someone from Iowa City shops in a neighboring city, a proportionate share of the tax goes back to Iowa City. Keep in mind, from 2010 to 2013, Iowa City collected a 1% local option sales tax, which generated more than $35 million. This time around, Iowa City officials want to use the money for street improvements, property tax relief, and affordable housing opportunity. Just a reminder to watch CBS 2 and Fox 28 tomorrow night. Keep in mind, Fox 28 News starts at 9. You'll get your first election results, and we'll continue at 10 o'clock. I want to send a thank you to University of Iowa Professor Tim Hagel for your analysis tonight. We truly appreciate it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you here tomorrow. Good night.